morning, everyone. So I'm interrupting in a sense, but just hoping to add some dimensions to the session that's ongoing. My task is to talk a little bit about the legal and policy context in which urban ecosystem-based adaptation can be integrated or even ramped up in Jamaica. Just please confirm before I go ahead that you're seeing my screen, you're hearing me clearly.
We are.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I want to go through a little bit of a treatment of, let's say, what a policy environment ought to look like for facilitating urban EBA. And then I wanted to take you very quickly through some policy recommendations. As Anna mentioned, I've been working with the project in reviewing Jamaica's legislative and policy context for urban EBA. And that has been very much a consultative process. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a feel of the findings of that study and the recommendations that have been made. I'll be moving relatively quickly because, we're trying to truncate a lot of information in a small time frame. And of course, you may have some questions as I go through. So just reflecting on the big picture, there has been some writing in the last 10 or 20 years from different parts of the world that have experimented with urban EBA and have, in a sense, attempted to look at their own policy context and how policies have been developed over time to better facilitate urban EBA. And the slide that you have before you is highlighting some of the best practices that have been promoted from different parts of the globe. The first one, ensuring that you are not treating urban EBA as, in a sense, treating it in such a thematic way that it doesn't come out or emerge as a specific priority, but rather that you are embedding green-specific urban planning policies in your urban planning framework. Other recommendations focus on long-term data collection so that there is a clear understanding of the benefits of urban EBA and document and promote those benefits, particularly ecosystem benefits. At the same time, urban EBA, as I'm sure you've been hearing, requires interdisciplinary studies to truly capture the multi-pronged benefits added to social, financial, just the enjoyment of a community space, so the aesthetics of an urban space. There are many different dimensions. And so you do have to have a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach to capturing and categorizing those benefits. Once you understand what the benefits are, another stream of thought focuses on the equitable distribution of ecosystem benefits. And in particular, looking at the vulnerable parts of your urban space, vulnerable communities, persons who are perhaps at an economic disadvantage, and ensuring that whatever systems you put in place are not only accessible by some parts of the urban community, but that you really have an understanding of how the entire social and economic construct of your community and environmental construct of your community can benefit from its ecosystem assets. There's quite a bit of writing on how public financing and incentives can prompt private sector partnership and ownership. And of course, that's going to be different depending on the economy of the country. And so countries that have more limited financial resources may look at incentivizing rather than funding. But then there are, between those two poles, there are variations in policy recommendations. But whichever recommendation you adopt, the issue of ensuring private sector partnership and ownership is going to be critical. And of course, ensuring that whatever you do is scalable so that municipalities are empowered, your professions are empowered, and this is governed in a way that is inclusive and captures benefits for all members of a community. So that's a global context. In terms of our national context, it's important to remember we do have a Charter of Rights that speaks to the right to a healthy environment in our Constitution. Of course, Vision 2030 also highlights the importance of Jamaica having a healthy natural environment, and that's broken down into a number of national outcomes, including outcomes that speak to hazard risk reduction, climate change adaptation, sustainable management of the environment, and sustainable urban and rural development. So when we break it down, what you'll find is that more or less in our legal framework, ecosystem-based adaptation, particularly in the urban context, falls into three groups or categories of laws and policies: urban planning, environmental, and climate change. And of course, those are all interrelated, both in how they're developed and how they function. But by analyzing each of them distinctly, we get to see not only where specific gaps are, but also how our recommendations can touch on all of the different factors that influence ecosystem-based adaptation. So that's the approach that we took. And I'm going to now talk about the strengths and challenges under each of those three sections, beginning with urban planning laws and policies. So the strengths we found in our Jamaican context, the regulatory system really facilitates collaboration between planning and environmental regulatory authorities. And so that conversation between urban planning focus and the environmental focus is facilitated, for example, through our multi-agency approval system for development plans. Does allow for a wide range of considerations to be factored in. And so you're not only looking, how do I put it? It enables you to step out of a silo approach in looking at development plans from multiple perspectives: social, financial, environmental. That is facilitated. The extent of the effectiveness of that is another question. But just on the basis of our legal and policy structure, that kind of interdisciplinary approach is facilitated. We did find in conducting interviews among the relevant planning agencies that they have begun to give consideration to the significance of urban EBA. And so we're seeing a stronger focus on ecosystems, for example, in the newer development orders, the KSA provisional development order being an example of that, a more comprehensive approach to planning that captures a range of ecosystem and adaptation issues. And that kind of, let's say, newer approach is reflected also in other developing policies and laws, including new building codes and the urban development, the planned urban development policy. However, in terms of gaps and barriers, there's little reference to climate change adaptation, particularly in legislation. Most of our legislation would be dated and so doesn't capture adaptation specific issues. And of course, ecosystem-based adaptation, within that framework, you wouldn't necessarily find that being identified as a preferred approach. Many of the newer policy documents that do create a context for integrating ecosystem considerations in urban planning do not yet have a full-fledged implementation framework. So I spoke of the development orders, the new building codes, those aren't yet fully operationalized. The enforcement mechanisms for climate change adaptation requirements tend to be dealt with at a relatively high level but at the operational level, they seem optional. There's no mandatory framework behind them, nor is there any single entity that assumes responsibility for integrating adaptation considerations into urban planning requirements. And there are other things that the stakeholders mentioned in terms of limited capacity to drive land use planning in a cross-sectoral way to categorize the benefits of green design and to ensure that all communities are benefiting equally. To move on to environmental issues, again, we have very strong regulations, and the regulations facilitate the integration of environmental regulators across the development process. We also have seen advances in terms of NEPA developing smart master plans and conditions of approval that really highlight for your development professionals ways in which they can integrate global best practice around ecosystem issues and environmental concerns in their urban planning, in their designs and plans for urban construction. However, well, before I reach to however, the fact that Jamaica is signatory to a number of the international conventions also means that, again, at the very highest level, we are seeing reference to biodiversity and climate change adaptation being converted into national plans and strategies. However, there are limitations, particularly in the strength of the enforcement mechanisms and sanctions around existing regulations. So having the regulations is one thing, having a strong enforcement mechanism and the adequacy of your sanctions for the types of activities that are typical, that becomes another issue that has to be addressed. So one of the factors that has been raised is that once a development is completed, for example, there are very limited options for binding private landowners in an ongoing way in terms of how they treat with their own property. And there's a limited scope for integrating communities in how we plan and oversee environmental regulations. On the climate change end, again, we have a climate change adaptation policy framework that's being updated along with the national adaptation plan being developed, and both are designed to include EbA strategies. However, again, these are incomplete documents, and so they don't apply in the way they're not currently operationalized. And as I mentioned before, we don't have climate change adaptation issues reflected at the legislative level. So capacity to implement across the board is not as strong when you're basing it on a policy framework document. Now, there are several recommendations that have been put on the table. I won't go through all of them in detail, but I will run through the recommendations very quickly. And these are recommendations for updating laws, updating policies, and changing practices. So at the very highest level, or to summarize it, the overall recommendation is that we include in our legislative and policy framework, particularly in those documents that are currently under development, the climate change policy framework, national adaptation plan, the development orders that are being developed or have a provisional status right now. And then there are other things like the Town and Country Planning Act that is slated for update, and urban renewal policy that is currently being developed. The idea is wherever we can, we should reflect that EbA solutions are a cost-effective means of adapting to the effects of climate change, and wherever possible should be prioritized on our climate change agenda. So wherever feasible, adaptation solutions ought to include the use of blue or green infrastructure and ought to promote a positive effect on biodiversity. You don't want the solutions that you choose to adapt to climate change to have a negative impact on biodiversity. So those are kind of high-level statements that could be included in any kind of policy or legislative or regulatory mechanism in order just to set the tone for prioritizing ecosystem-based approaches and the use of ecosystem services in a sustainable way to support adaptation efforts. Now, how does that break down? Again, there are very many recommendations that were given. Now we can share the slides or the documentation afterwards, which I'll run through really quickly. So recommendations include strengthening community participation in developing policies, guidelines, and plans, using our Local Improvement Amenities Act to enforce that a requirement for any new public amenities, new public parks, even parking lots, to integrate EbA strategies wherever feasible. Updating our building regulations, not just to enforce the existing building codes, but there's an international building code for green design that has not been adapted for local use. We could look at that as well. Mandatory integration of ecosystem services, particularly in architectural and engineering plans and designs, and therefore having technical guidelines for our engineers and architects to be able to implement across the board, and strengthening the enforceability of these by having renewable permits or other ways of using regulatory mechanisms that bind privately owned properties beyond the development phase. So to give some examples of this, using tree preservation orders, endorsements on a title, restrictive covenants, ticketing systems, all of these could be used to convert compliance from something that you do when you're building or developing to something that a property owner, whether a homeowner or owner of commercial property, has to consider the environmental impact and the footprint of how they use their property over time. So having things that are endorsed on a title, for example, or moving towards a ticketing system to enforce environmental regulations could help to fill that gap. Other recommendations include urban forestry guidelines and policies that guide the average user in terms of the how and why of protecting urban habitats and endemic species, and how we can integrate these considerations more effectively in not just planning and approvals, but just how the average urban dweller treats with and interacts with the environment. And there's issues around statutory penalties, having a legal framework for climate change adaptation, which is part of the existing plan of the government of Jamaica, and updating the national plan on biological diversity to better reflect the use of ecosystem resources. Now, in terms of mainstreaming EbA practices, there are a number of practical recommendations that accompany these policy and law recommendations, including having guidelines and self-check mechanisms that break down the breadth and complexity of our development and planning and approval processes into simple checklists that a developer or even a property owner can adapt from time to time and use to sort of guide their own level of compliance or the extent to which they're using the ecosystem in a sustainable way. This could be accompanied by having a green building design concept, or the forestry department is working on guidelines for urban forestry or a green plan for Kingston. These are some ways in which you can convert the sort of high level policy recommendations into practical documentation that someone can use. And of course, ensuring that training, certification, anywhere where we have academic or licensing requirements, integrating EbA in those requirements, integrating EbA requirements in government contracting forms and templates, so that wherever green design is possible, it can be integrated in how government updates its buildings, updates its facilities, builds new facilities, etc. And of course, that will require building capacity across the board. Building capacity not just in the government systems, but also among communities and civil society groups, to be able to hold accountable the systems of decision making in a more strategic way. Ensuring that we do enough outreach. We have simplified versions of our guiding documents, like our development orders. Every citizen in every space should understand the scope and content of the development orders that guide that space, and why. What's the reasoning behind some of the environmental protection mechanisms, and how it helps to make each of us more resilient and protected from certain types of the immediate hazards and disaster risks that are very recognizable, as well as the climate change long-term risks that, are not always as recognizable. Strengthen accountability and participatory governance measures, including how civil society assists, or the voice that civil society can have in reporting under the treaties that Jamaica has signed, and finding ways to incentivize the use of urban EbA in development planning, as well as ensuring that our municipalities are well trained. People who are elected to office in the local government context, being exposed to the benefits of ecosystem protection, so that they're not looking at development through a lens that excludes the sustainable or holistic approach that urban EbA would require. This slide is a way of sort of breaking down the varying recommendations on the different types of authorities, regulators, and importantly, pulling out the role of municipalities, the role of private sector, the role of communities, and ensuring that in every context, there's an understanding of the cost benefit and the role that each group or individual can play based on their level of authority or influence. And ensuring that we kind of break it down into relatively practicable, practical issues, some of which I know you would have covered, or you are planning to cover in the training material, but making that kind of content and information available to the wider public so that they can, make decisions in a way that is informed. So that is the very quick run through, and like I said, I can make the slides available, and I'm guided by you, but if there's time for one or two questions, I'm happy to field those as well.
Thanks, Tania. Any questions, any comments? I know there was something in the chat from Shamoy, I believe. Shamoy. Okay, she says there is a climate change policy framework that includes adaptation and mitigation. There is no climate change adaptation policy framework. So the truth is, Jamaica, I believe, was one of the first countries in the Caribbean to actually put in place a climate change policy framework. And I don't know if Shamoy, you'd want to elaborate on that, but they were one of the first in the region.
Well, let me just say before any elaboration, my apologies. Sometimes when you're truncating for like you're putting in abbreviations, you end up overusing CCA. So yeah, sorry about that. It actually was pointed out previously, and I forgot to update the document. So yes, you just keep saying CCA because that's what you're accustomed to, but yes, thanks for that. And we'll make sure to review the documents to have the correct terminology reflected.
All right. Anybody else want to share anything?
Well, I just want to comment to say I agree with what she's saying, and a lot of what is being done. I mean, she has mentioned, and we have work to do here, so I will make sure that from our side that we ensure that our policies are aligned to what you're saying. For example, the Town and Country Planning Act and so on. So I'm really happy for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rose. Anybody else? No?
May I just add that, so we've had consultation sessions that involved many of the departments and agencies. I think some of the names even in this room I'm recognizing. Within that context, we shared the draft policy briefs. And I know there's some people from those organizations that are in this session that weren't in those sessions. So, happy to share the draft policy briefs in this context as well. So that if you have any other, comments or recommendations, those can be included. Okay.
Thanks, Tania. Again, one last time, any comments, any questions, any clarification for Tania before she leaves? No? All right. I would say my own thank you, Tania, for your presentation. And I guess it would make even more sense this afternoon when we just look briefly at mainstreaming, because in your presentation, you really provided, just where, for example, we can mainstream, for example, and what are the opportunities for mainstreaming in particular policy frameworks, who should mainstream in terms of the different stakeholder groups. And so I think this afternoon, when we do that particular topic, a lot of this will come back into play in terms of what you presented to the group. So I'll hand over to Anna to do her thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tania. Really appreciate your time. I think it was very informative for the group as well, and will lead to much more discussion later in the day. So thanks again.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good Friday and enjoy the rest of your training. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tania.
Thank you.
All right, so my turn now to share the screen again. We were on farming, urban farming. I think I'm sharing the right one. I don't know. What is it already done? Okay, so we were looking at things like vertical farming, which we had discussed in the past, hydroponics, the whole system of cultivating without soil. And of course, in this whole notion of hydroponics, you can have the recycling and the reuse of water, which of course could save on water. Amphibious farming, anyone ever heard of that? The whole notion of building artificial islands in water. I will show you an example of what it looks like, and I believe we are very familiar with aquaponics, bringing up aquaculture and animals like fish or shrimp with vegetables or herbs. I don't know if we do that in Jamaica. I know we do the fish part of it and shrimp, but I don't know if vegetables and herbs are added to the same aquaponic, like the same system at the same time. Anybody is aware? But what are some of the benefits of urban farming? Again, many of the benefits are very similar, you know, in terms, well, this one is a bit different because you do have the notion of stimulation, you know, job creation, new job opportunities. And how many people have heard of the concepts farm to table? It's like this big thing now. Everybody has a farm to table concept with organic in between. Some of the, you know, the hotels. So for example, there is a hotel in St. Lucia. It's a very upper end hotel in St. Lucia that focuses on, you know, just wellness and well-being, and, you know, it's thousands of US dollars a night. And one of the things that it promotes is this whole farm to table and this urban farming. So there are different opportunities for urban farming beyond this whole notion of backyard gardening, but also involving, for example, your hotel and restaurant chains to engage in these sort of activities and to have different types of branded products. It contributes to food security. There's also a lot of, in the Caribbean in particular, I'm not so sure about Jamaica, but we do have 4-H clubs, but there is a lot of activity around urban farming in school environments to really begin to sort of teach children more about farming and food and its use as educational opportunities. There's a lot of it, for example, in the Bahamas. All right. Anybody wants to add anything here?
We were saying Stush in the Bush in St. Mary, Jamaica, as that same concept.
Yeah, they have a farm to table.
So you visit the farm, right? They grow their produce, they reap, and then they have a dining and.
Right, so that may be that's one example, but I mean, you know, you can have more of those across the country. So yes, Stush in the Bush is one example. So these are some visualizations here. Raised beds on the left, amphibious farming on the right. Amphibious farming was inspired by the Aztec way of farming, and it's called Chinampas. It uses artificial islands built in water. The islands are secured in place by, you see those gray staves at the side, by these wooden staves into a lake bed, establishing a perimeter with a woven reed fence. It creates a grid with large enough canals between each island crop bed for a small boat to move through. Planting beds use compost produced in situ as the growing medium. Now, if we look back at all of the different types of urban farming, which are the ones that we deem most applicable in the Jamaican context? And you're thinking about things like size of plot, size of your house plot, when you're talking about things like backyard gardening, or where are there opportunities to incorporate these?
Hi, I think now in Jamaica that we could use we can use many of these in many different scenarios. Offices could put in raised beds or rooftop gardens, schools.
How would an office, share with us how you think an office could use raised beds, just how you think.
Because a lot of offices have like areas where outside of like the parking area where they could have areas probably towards the back, up on the roof, different sections. Some of these offices also have canteens or things like that, whereby the person who is cooking on the canteen can use what they are growing to incorporate. So it doesn't have to be like actual, maybe like hardcore produce, but things like herbs and spices and stuff like that. So I think hotels can definitely use rooftop gardens, as we discussed earlier in the session. Hotels
Backyard
like
gardens
Rock,
too.
right. I think we also are not using shipping container farms or just even shipping containers. There are so many things that we can do with shipping containers that I just don't think we're taking advantage of. Even though I know that they are now becoming rather expensive, I do think that we can use them in so many different ways. And actually hearing that you probably can use them for farming is something that I think we can do. I do think that we need to have more interconnected backyard gardens because when you look at cities like even Atlanta, they have urban farms in the middle of the city where they're supplying local. Most of Kingston or produce is coming from the country areas and coming into Kingston, where we don't really have many people growing in the middle of Kingston, and that's where we're going to get our stuff. Everything is coming from outside, coming in. So I do think those things could be helpful. I know that we do a lot of hydroponics up in the hills of like Blue Mountain and stuff like that, and actually a lot of aquaponics, but as you were saying, in terms of fish or shrimp. But I do think we can actually start to diversify, because even when you watch a lot of these documentaries, you realize that they're doing a lot of this type of amphibious farming or just cultivating things like seaweed, oysters, so many things that I don't think we are even taking advantage of, that we actually need to start looking into how we can do more of this and actually have more businesses geared towards this type of thing. And as you're saying, it will help the environment and help us to produce more food and for food security. So that's my
Yeah, and I think for Jamaica, you know, food security is a concept that we banned about. We all want food security, but I think it's important to also recognize that in Jamaica, diets are not healthy. And opportunity, especially in cities, and we're talking about like in inner city communities and so on, where the price of food is a problem and access to healthier foods like fruits and vegetables. If you think about what is referred to as the basket of goods, right? And each country has their own minimum basket of goods that a family of 5 can afford for 1 week. Our basket of goods does not include fruit and vegetables. Yet, you know, you would think that there are a lot of fruit trees everywhere, but they're really not. You know, so can we begin to look at ways in which, as we push to develop these communities, and, you know, we're talking about, you know, we're giving away, we're doing social housing, and we're doing, you know, we're trying to get a lot of these communities out of crime, and we're providing, you know, all the different social amenities. Maybe we also need to be looking at situations like these. How do we incorporate trees? How do we incorporate urban farming? What would it entail? You know, you don't have to have the containers looking horrible, and, you know, how do we design them in a way that they could be in communities? What is the population of this community? What would it mean to be planting things like callaloo and tomatoes or lettuce, and how would it work? And how would a community share these proceeds, for example? So as we look at some of these EBA and their application, we also need to look at them within the context of socioeconomic development and, within the context of socioeconomic development, and also within some of the ills that we are confronted with as a society. How do we use this to get unattached youth involved in agriculture? You know, what kind of crops can they grow? You know, can we use these sort of urban farming techniques to diversify the kind of crops that we grow in Jamaica. So now in the Blue Mountain, we're growing strawberries. We don't have to buy strawberries from the US or Canada. We could buy them from here. There are other types of crops that we can actually grow that could add. I mean, what about things like flowers, for example? So these are all opportunities within this EBA that we could link back to you know, some of the social ills that confront us, whether they're health or whether there are things related to crime and violence, etc. Tani?
Yes, I just quickly wanted to say, I know of one particular organization making an impact altogether. It's a nonprofit that actually does urban farming in inner cities in Jamaica. There are a few programs now. I think we went to one in Hannahtown, and they had one in Denham Town too, where they're planting not just fruit trees, but other types of agricultural products. The only issue that I think he has found is the sustainability of it. You know, you go in, you train, you try to make sure they're either attached to a church, a community center, or something like that. But sometimes, even when you think you have community ownership, after you leave or the persons from the organizations go in, then it falls short and no one takes it up to continue. So it really has to be something that persons or the communities within themselves take it on for it to actually make sense and for people to continue it. So I think that's what happens with a lot of these things, is that they get started on, unless it's like owned by one particular person or one entity. Sometimes the buy-in is not there because there's no one. They think that people need to be continuously coming in to do the work. So it's actually trying to find a balance. But he's seen where it works. He has like proprietary type of fertilizer where the things grow quickly. So it's very helpful. And I think something like that should be replicated across Jamaica, so that we get into the practice of this type of urban farming.
Before I go on to Howard, what about things like competitions among communities? You know, you have communities, can we look and see which community, if we gave each community 5 containers, who is producing food for the community and who is doing that? How do we create the enabling environment to ensure that maybe unattached youth in the community becomes part of this? And I think it has to go more beyond demonstration and encouraging, but related to how we set up policy that focuses on, say, rehabilitation of an inner city community. What are the requirements? What do we need to do? Who supervises what? Who does what? Because yes, you can show people, well, this is nice, this is how you do it, but everybody has to work. They don't see an economic opportunity coming from it, so there are issues. So we also need to think about how we properly mainstream some of these ideas. And it doesn't have to be legislation, but how do we put it in policy? What are the requirements for proper institutionalization and sustainability? Because they're all great ideas, but how do we get these ideas to sort of gel and to be sustainable? I saw Howard's hand up, but I think Howard has been dropping in and out. Howard?
Yeah, my hand was, it was raised in error.
Oh, okay. All right. So when we think about the cost considerations for urban farming, what do you think the cost considerations can be? Or maybe, sorry. If we wanted to set up urban farms in every single community in Jamaica, or I think PIOJ has this list of the 100 most volatile communities in Jamaica who they're working with. And if we say that this is a great idea, this is something to do? What would be some of the costs associated with that? You'd have land costs, you'd have construction and implementation, and always maintenance costs. So all of these different types of EBA come with land costs. If you need to access land, acquire land, if you, depending on the approach you're going to take, you're going to have some construction and implementation as well as maintenance costs. So things related to weeding, whether you're using organic fertilizer, watering, harvesting, etc. Michaela?
Yes, what came to me just now, thinking about cost, one of the things that you wouldn't have had here is the whole notion of quality, the standard of food, for example, that those urban farming would the food produce that would come from those urban farming, the standard of the food will probably go up for questioning if it is that those food produce would be placed on the market commercially. So the whole Bureau of Standard in terms of how the agricultural practice, if those are good practices, and if it is suitable to
Does
really
the
go
Bureau of
on
Standard
the,
look at vegetables now, do they?
I'm not sure, but I was thinking about it. If
Why would
that
it
would
be
be like a
different?
cost.
Why would it be different from any food grown if it's grown in a community? Why would it be different? If we're providing the capacity to grow the food, they're getting seeds, encouraging organic fertilizer. It's not really the Bureau of Standards who looks at standards related to agriculture. It's actually agriculture, but they don't usually look at internal agriculture either to say, well, oh, you're using pesticides or fertilizers. Because the truth is, most of the stuff we buy in the supermarket, they aren't labeled. So do we have
or
where they're
maybe
coming from? We don't know where the pak choy is coming from. We don't know where the carrots is coming from. I mean, how many people know that the tomato you eat each and every day now is genetically modified? I mean, all are. That's why they don't bruise or they rot from the inside, because they're genetically modified, and most of them do have a pig gene in them to allow for that. So I don't think, I get your point, but at the same time, it's fruit and vegetables, and to export, there are standards. Not to say that they're not in standards locally and that we shouldn't. We need to move away from like chemical pesticides and fertilizers, but these things provide opportunities to create an environment. If we're going to be looking at planting more in inner city communities and establishing container farms, you know, like urban farming across the city, the idea is from the very beginning that we establish these not just within the construct of employment for a few unattached youth in the community, income. We should also attach to it the notion of, and in addition to food security, better food, reducing the incidence of non-communicable diseases. Once you start, you will also want to look at the whole notion of how do we ensure that from the very beginning, we are internationally competitive. So to sell your fruits and vegetables overseas, in Canada, UK, and the US, we have to comply with certain standards related to maximum residue levels of pesticide and fertilizers on fruits and vegetables. Because the fact is, no matter how much you wash, scrub, bake, broil, cook vegetables, there is going to be an MRL level on the vegetable, which is directly related to the amount of pesticides and chemical pesticides and fertilizers that you use. So even with all the trade agreements, countries say we're not taking MRL levels over a certain amount, and this also includes processed goods. So, and that's to protect the health of their population. So in the same way, if we're to establish these things locally and within like inner city communities, volatile communities, we can start from the very beginning to look at standards and look at international competitiveness of what we're producing at the local level.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? So can we go on to open green spaces? This is a visualization of an open green space. Do we have any of these in our urban centers? So they're known, as it says here, to cool cities, counter the urban island heat effect. In fact, in many cities, temperatures are increasing, are about 3 to 8 degrees warmer. How do we see this? This is a comment or a statement, sorry, that has been bandied about that cities, the temperatures are increasing about 3 to 8 degrees. This whole notion of the urban heat island, we're experiencing it, as we said, in Jamaica, because we have a lot of heat being emitted from buildings, transportation. I mean, we haven't mentioned transportation a lot in this course, but heat is also emitted from that. And we lack, of course, shading and vegetation around our streets, in our cities, in our communities. Do we have any, if we look at the visualization of what open green spaces look like, how do we feel about open green spaces in our urban centers? Are we linking urban green spaces with like our ecological corridors to improve biodiversity, animal species, etc.? What are the green spaces, open green spaces that we have in Kingston? What about Hope Gardens? Is that an open green space? Anybody here? Hero Circle is another example. I missed your comment, Adrian. Hope Gardens, Devon House, open green spaces. Anywhere else? So when we think about the functions of these open green spaces, like many of the, like many of the other examples, we're looking at flood mitigation, stormwater control, reducing heat by providing shade. Anything else? Would open green spaces also do things like, they would also do things like remove pollutants from the air, from the soil. They would support biodiversity in your urban areas. So we have a few examples. Can we list any examples outside of Kingston of open green spaces within our urban areas? Anything in Mobay we can think about? Anything in Negril, anything in Santa Cruz, anything in, some of these would have like open farms and so on, which are green spaces. Harmony Park in Mobay, Royal Palm Reserve in Negril. So what would be your sort of argument to reduce? We have had notions in the past of reducing open green spaces for development. Many of you would be too young to know that many years ago, there was this whole fiasco related to the converting a portion of Hope Gardens for housing. That housing project later became Long Mountain. So Long Mountain, I believe, was approved for Hope Gardens. And back in the day, of course, you know, you had the different lobbyists, etc. And it was moved. An alternative location was found for Hope Gardens that became Long Mountain. Let us kind of visualize. Everybody knows Long Mountain, right? Can we visualize Long Mountain in a part of Hope Gardens? One person doesn't know Long Mountain. It's across from Peter and Paul, and it's going up the mountain. You see it coming in from, where do you see it? I can't even think. But what are your thoughts about, you know, just converting some of that green space into housing development? What may have happened today? That was like about maybe 15 years ago. Anybody ever heard about this? Anybody heard?
The Long Mountain issue was during Minister Douglas's time.
Yeah, it was a long,
While I
long
was
time
at the
ago. I was like a
ministry,
child.
right.
I was like a
Right.
young. I was young.
Oh. So I am old, so it was during my.
No, but we was young, them times, Rose. We wasn't old.
I am old.
A long time ago. We're old now, but we were young then. So these young people in here never heard of it. But there was a big thing to actually
Controversy, right.
remove, and the arguments around the green space at the time, it was actually when PJ Patterson was Prime Minister.
Right.
And he was the one who said, okay, I'm gonna listen, but not to the environmentalists on this. But none of the arguments that came forward spoke about some of these issues. You know, like it was more related to, you know, this is the environment, this is our heritage, this is our culture, we can't get rid of Hope Gardens. There was really no in-depth discussion around things like, you know, the potential for urban heat islands, you know, all the different things that these open green spaces can do, you know, the cooling effect. So nobody else but Rose and I heard of this. So Anna, you never heard of this. You're young too, but still.
Too young.
But can you imagine? I mean, most people know Long Mountain. So can you imagine what Long Mountain would have looked like? You know Hope Gardens, you know Long Mountain. Think of Long Mountain in Hope Garden. What are your thoughts? I know it's close to lunchtime, but
It definitely, I think, would have decreased the aesthetics of the area. And from an environmental perspective, I think it would have increased flooding with all of that concrete.
it's a lot, huh? I mean, when you think about Long Mountain, it's just amazing that it was approved to go there. The approval was done, and I think it's the Prime Minister at the time who said, we're not doing it. Yes, it's approved, so we are bound to give the developer a space, but we're not bound to give him Hope Gardens. And we're not. We're going to be giving him there, which had its issues as well, but let's go to some types. There are different categories of green spaces. How many of you have heard of things like pocket parks? So rather than a big Hope Gardens, they have these things called pocket parks. And in some communities, like I could see a pocket park in oh, what's the name of that place? Hope Pastures. How many people drive through Hope Pastures? And if
That's
you're
true.
coming from Ligony, I guess?
Yes.
So if you're
Hope
coming from
Pastures,
UE and you're driving through Hope Pastures, on your right, you see this park. It's no longer really used as a park, but there are tennis courts and there is a park. That is an example of a pocket park. It's like just a small recreation area where even within townhouses, communities, this is something that should be in the requirement for there to be like pocket parks, which could serve as a little playground, a dog park. So instead of building 20 townhouses, you can build 19 and create a pocket park. You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, a lot of the older ones have it like Oaklawns and have a massive, so outside they have all of the townhouses, but in the middle of it, they have a big enough park area with all this recreation. I haven't been around there in a very, very long time to know if it's
There's a nice
green or if
one.
there are trees or, but I knew that's how it looked in the very beginning, that there was a pocket park. And another small one is right in front of the atrium in like Trafalgar Park, right there.
Right.
Yes.
And there is one on, there are these townhouses in New Kingston. When I was really, really young, I lived there. They're called Worthington. I can't remember, but I used to live there. It's on Worthington Avenue.
Yeah, those ones, the older ones tend to have
Right,
like,
it's an older one, and you had
Yeah.
two little townhouses, and everybody's living room veranda opened out into this huge, in the middle, it was like a park.
yeah.
With trees and everything, and then that one end had a pool, but that is an example of an open green space. There are lots of trees, etc. So it's about how do we bring back these. So within the quest for building all of these townhouses and creating this space, how do we bring back this notion of open green space? So it doesn't have to be the size of Hope Gardens, but it can be small spaces, small that, you know, you can walk your dog, you can have vegetable planters, you can have some neighborhood recreation, etc. And if there are vacant lots in communities, how then can we convert that into pocket parks? We also have examples of natural playgrounds. What are those? Similar to a pocket park, but they're designed as playgrounds, and we don't see a lot of those in our urban centers anymore. Partially, I think maybe because of things like crime and violence. And then we have things like climate-proof residential gardens. And this, of course, is just your residential, your small garden area within urban areas. Right? We're seeing a lot less of those given the types of construction that we are seeing, but there are still opportunities to facilitate open green spaces within our development planning. And if we're to use the example of these three, the one that would probably be most applicable right now may be things like pocket parks. All right. And these are just visualizations of how each of them actually look. So you have a community and you have a little park, you have a natural playground, you know, where children can play, if it is accompanied by, I don't know, a water area, etc. And of course, you have your residential gardens, which we're already very familiar with. So these are the first three that we're going to look at. The other, after lunch, we'll focus more on others such as green corridors, linear natural infrastructure. But what you're realizing is that the benefits that all of these provide, they're very similar for our urban areas. And the idea is how can we incorporate them in our development planning, within our spatial frameworks, within the thrust for new housing developments, where can they go? And how can we use them effectively to achieve the benefits that they provide? The parks could also be adopted by a company. Okay, so Anna has a point, as the one on Lord Nelson in New Kingston is. I'm seeing some comments in here, so let me just start from the top. Okay. Right, we're moving away from building townhouses, but they're still happening, Ashley. You're looking at high rises, but there's still a lot of townhouses. There are still townhouses being built. Pocket parks tend to be those small areas that have been retained within subdivisions, okay. Duncan, I think it becomes more necessary as we move towards high-rise living, as it becomes a literal concrete jungle. These have been replaced with apartments with entertainment spaces on the roof with fake grass. Ashley, these are the pocket parks. Parks could be adopted.
No, I'm saying we're moving away from pocket parks. I've been around recently, and I'm not seeing any new townhouse developments going up. What I'm mostly seeing, even in quote unquote rural areas, are apartments with
more apartments, but you still have townhouses. Check out like Matalan homes and stuff. They're going up. Then you have new ones opening. And then what you also have is this intermix between townhouses and apartments in the same environment. For some of the bigger ones, you do have, you understand? But a lot of apartments, agree with you, plenty more than townhouses. And plenty of concrete. And they seem to be occupying these very small lots. So there is not much you can do around them. Because think of it, a house was there before, it's now an apartment complex. You have to think about parking. There is some amount of thing for parking on the ground, but then you have to think about visitor parking. So it is a problem. And then Ashley, most natural playgrounds I have observed, this is from Ashley, over the years have not been converted to multifunction areas with rubber bricks. The few that remain are abundant with overgrown greenery. So can we make a change with some of these? If we do have the space, so we're saying we're seeing them, how can we now incorporate them as part of development? I think it has, but do we determine it by the housing market? This is from Camille. I think it has been determined by the housing market, and the townhouse developments are not as easy to sell. Oh, what is this? Oh, you mean oh, this is related to the apartments. Okay. Apparently it's requiring more apartments. That is true too. But how can we get back some of these green spaces that existed before? So they're there now, they're idle, it's still a green space. What would be the opportunity to convert it into something useful? Any ideas? Comments? Shawnee?
Yeah, so good afternoon. So just thinking based on your question just now about the opportunities that exist, I know there are different groups, they do their projects and they seek to do activities. So just thinking that maybe there could be some encouragement to have these spaces, to have those activities done on these spaces, whether it is inviting schools, organizations to build, to plant in these particular locations, because I know they would like encourage like these environmental groups and so on, they may encourage them to have these environmental projects, and they could be focused in these particular spaces. So having that space as an open space, but you know, you're calling on persons to do their activities within that space. It could probably help with some of the costs that would be associated to getting the space to where you would want it to be.
All right, thanks, Shonali. So I think we are at lunch now until 2, we come back. So unless there are no questions or comments, I'll let you go and we'll resume at 2.